Can you hear me?
There we go. Anyway, it's one of those things.
Okay, I want to call this meeting to order. This is the Planning Board, February 21st, 2023. This is a work session, so there are no public hearings tonight. Let me first introduce the board members. Starting at my extreme left is Doug Braskin. Next to Doug, Peter Goodwin. Mike Hodder, who is the vice chairman of the Planning Board. To my right is Brad Harriman, who is the representative from the Selectmen, and Julie Jacobs, who is an alternate. Julie, would you be willing to sit for Von Dugan?
Sure, I can do that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, first item are the solar regulations. So if you want to go through that, Tavis, that would be great.
I can go through it briefly. Remember a couple of meetings ago, I referenced putting this on the work session or the work schedule for the planning board. I provided you a copy of the New Hampshire model solar zoning ordinance, which is very general. Here's some topic areas, here's some things to consider, here's some things that you might want to include or not include. So what I put in the packet for the planning board this evening be 175, 216, et cetera, going through solar energy. It outlines the various definitions, what is a photovoltaic system, what is a rated nameplate capacity, and the series of definitions you see in front of you, specifically in order to outline what is a large, medium, and small freestanding solar project. So for those that don't have the handout in front of them, i.e. on TV, a medium scale, this is all based on square footage of solar panel. So a medium system would be 1,750, but less than 40,000 square feet of surface. A large energy system would be greater than 40,000 square feet. And also the definitions break out roof mounted and then small scale, which would be 750 square feet or less. So if you think of your average solar panel, it's really breaking it out based on number of panels. On the bottom of the second page, I put together a use/zoning district breakout where rooftop solar is allowed in all districts. Medium size or medium scale ground mounted solar would be permitted in those zones that you see at the top, basically all of the business districts. And then medium scale and large scale would be a conditional use permit in the residential zones. Large scale would be a conditional use permit in the commercial zones as a primary use. So again, this table breaks it out between principal use and accessory use. But then small scale and medium scale will be conditional in every district in Wolfeboro.
So the only one that would be allowed by right is the rooftop?
Rooftop is an accessory in the residential zones, and rooftop is a principal use
Okay, and
in the commercial.
I think we've talked about this before, but the rooftop would have to get a building permit, right?
It's actually an electrical permit, but yes.
Yeah, okay, and then somebody would check to make sure the roof was okay?
Not that the roof is okay, how the rooftop solar is connected to the electric service of the house is okay.
Okay. All right, is there...
I have yet to see a question about whether a roof is capable of holding the structure
Okay.
at the building permit level that we've seen so far, but that would be part of the discussion if the building official had concerns. Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Is it the building inspector or is the electric department who would do that analysis of the hookup?
Building inspector. You have to remember that the electricity or the electric charge is going directly into the home. So MED has control from the pole to the meter. Solar is introduced after the meter, therefore it's a building code question, not a utility question.
I don't know whether that's exactly correct, in that if you are grid tied, you are now feeding that electricity back into the grid, and there needs to be appropriate cutoffs so that if the grid is down, whatever, and the building inspector would deal with that kind of issue?
Yes. So MED is involved if someone anticipates creating enough that they're going to be backfeeding, if you will, the surplus energy, and there is a net meter in place, and that's something MED is part of.
I mean, the reason I say that is that when I put in my electric system, and it had to be approved by the electric department, and they were the ones who came and did the inspection of that electric.
Going back out.
Right.
Correct.
Could you just go over how you determine the height for the rooftop? You said 25% of the zoning district's maximum allowed height. Can you just, for the public, could you just describe that, please? Oh, I was just looking at
top of page 3.
Exceptions.
DA.
DA1.
That's generally in line with what the ordinance allows for appurtenant structures like chimneys and then, satellite dishes and things like that. Typically, if it's on a roof, it's flat against the roof, and you're going to get nowhere near 25%. But there are instances where to get the angle that has to be stood up. But again, you're at the midpoint of the extra extension, so 25% is actually fairly generous. One of the things, if we look at DA2, something the board may want to consider is, I mean, this is a draft from other places, if you will. There's nothing magic about 21 feet in Wolfeboro.
There shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I would suggest, well, it may not be 21 that shouldn't be, but the question is, are accessory solar panels that are ground mounted going to be considered accessory structures? And in order for it to be incidental and subordinate to, does the board want to have a height? 2 could come out entirely. The reason I ask about accessory structures is if you have the standard lot size and you already have a chicken coop and a detached garage, and freestanding solar is considered an accessory structure, now you need the added lot size. So we can add solar-only structures to the exemptions from accessory structure in the definition, or you might want to put a height on it. There's nothing magic about 21 feet in height in Wolfeboro.
I was just thinking of the solar installation on Route 11 in Rochester. On the left as you're heading south, there are 3 or 4 freestanding rotating systems. They must be 40, 50 feet high. They're really huge. We put 21 feet on as a maximum. We are eliminating that possibility for solar. Before we eliminate that possibility for solar, I think the board should be careful that that's exactly what it wants to do by having a 21-foot height requirement.
Correct. And it's not, I mean, in this particular instance, it's referencing the tallest point of the structure, not the middle of the structure.
Yeah.
So with the example you just used, at a height of 40 feet, that would be a solar panel taller than we allow for a home.
That's my point.
So we just need, the board just needs to think about that number before it puts a limit on.
That kind of solar solution might be good to have in town somewhere, rather than writing an ordinance that eliminates it before we even get going. Think about it before you do that. That's all
Correct.
I'm suggesting.
And then along the same lines, DB is looking at to the side or rear of the primary structure. So if you're driving through a residential neighborhood, you don't have a solar tracker in everyone's front yard. Maybe that's an issue, maybe that's not an issue, something for the board to consider. Medium and large scale is looking at a 60-foot setback. Now, obviously, if you're in the village residential, a 60-foot setback pretty much is going to destroy your lot. But then again, it's really just all things to keep in mind. The board might want to look at the bottom of page 2 in the draft to figure out what zones and how.
Yeah, that in my opinion, the board's going to need to think that through much more carefully than it has so far, and understood this is simply a draft.
Correct.
But you've only got, in this draft, there are only 3 categories of solar size. There's big, which is 40,000 square feet, meaning an acre. There's
Roughly.
medium, which is 1.7 thousand square feet, 1,750 square feet up to an acre. And then there's below 1,750 square feet. That medium, that middle-sized category, I think needs to get opened up more, because currently you allow, with conditional use permit, a 39,000 square foot solar system in the shorefront residential district. Now, it's never going to be built,
Correct.
obviously, so it shouldn't even be allowed. Kind of take that out altogether. But you do also allow it in the rural agricultural and rural residential, but you disallow large scale, which could be 1 square foot slightly bigger than medium size, but disallowed because it's a little bit too big and they have to go to the ZBA for a variance. I think that middle category needs to get opened.
Sure.
And while you're on that,
This original draft is based on square footage of the typical panel.
Yeah, and
So
that's,
it's not likely that it's going to be the 1 square foot or 2. It's going to be a full,
or say a panel then. So
a
yes,
panel
it's a
difference,
panel.
correct.
The other problem is a conjectural or conceptual problem that the draft is attempting to equate the square footage of a solar system with the kilowatt output of the solar system. And so you're trying to cram 2 different categories into one and then build your zoning around that amalgamation, whereas I think the board needs to think, do we want to decide on what kind of solar is to be allowed in different districts based upon how much it puts out, or based upon how big a size the thing is? Make one or the other, and then define your large scale not by the output, but by the actual physical size it's going to require on the ground.
yeah, Mike, I would agree with that, because as the technology improves, you'll hopefully gain greater output for a given area. And also, while on that topic, Tavis, a minor point, but in A, it says solar system more than 40,000. In B, it says less than 40,000, but it doesn't address exactly 40,000. So one of those needs to be changed.
We'll put the 1 in somewhere.
The one somewhere, yeah.
It'll be
And didn't
all
we
right.
just learn, like last week, that if you've got too many solar panels running in the field, you can blow up the substation? So some of that, I think, is going to be self-regulating at some point as to how big you can actually go in a certain place.
Well, what we
trying to
learned
sell it
last
out.
week is if you do more solar that might fit, you might run the chance of having to upgrade the substation.
That too.
Tavis, you talked about the idea that this is an accessory structure.
Well, it would be accessory if it was, so if you had a single-family home and you wanted a couple of trackers on the ground next to it, or you have something like the board saw last week where there's nothing on the lot but a hayfield, and you plant 23 acres of solar array, that would be a primary use.
But if it's an accessory structure on that particular lot, which I own, in other words, I can build a chicken coop as another structure on my house, but I'm not supposed to have 10 chicken coops.
Correct.
So does this count necessarily as an accessory structure?
That was
Yes.
my question.
It's up to us to decide, I think.
Okay.
Other questions?
In your what would you call them, justification, your authorization section in the purpose paragraph, there's a whole slew of statutes over and above 6721 through 3A, which authorize solar. And I think it'd probably be a good idea if they were included as well. You
And,
could find them yourself if you want, or I can give them to you now if you want, whichever the board would prefer. But 67417, Roman 1, lowercase j, and 67436, Roman 2, lowercase k. Both talk about, both authorize solar in particular circumstances. And 6721, Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, 3A, 3D, and 4, all authorize municipalities to run solar regulations. And you'll find in that handouts that I sent that Kathy sent to all the board members, in the Charleston ordinance, they reference, I think they reference 67417 or maybe 36. So I think we should expand them.
Yeah, also, under that purpose section, 672:1, and then to 3A, I think we should also include D, which is talks about an unreasonable interpretation.
Yeah, that's what part of the ones I gave to Towers just now.
You did say, okay, all right, sorry. And shouldn't we include as amended for the RSAs?
Sure.
Yeah, some wiggle language to account for changes in the statute. But then it's really incumbent upon the board to keep up with that anyway, so.
I have a solar system, and if it were ground mounted, it's not, it's on a roof. But if it were ground mounted, if that's an accessory structure, could I then put up a woodshed too, because that's also associated with solar energy?
So my suggestion was that ground-mounted solar be excluded from accessory buildings and structures in the
So
definition.
These things need to be defined, and they, but that's to me an issue. Then so.
Are we just jumping around here, or are we going straight through? So I have a couple of questions farther in.
Go ahead, Julie.
So we're jumping around? If we go another page, E7, what is a performance bond? I don't understand that definition. I'm being dumb now.
Basically, somebody comes in and he says, in order to put this over there, it's going to be X amount of dollars. So they post that amount of dollars, sometimes in 110% of that value, to make sure they install what they say they were going to install. As they install it, that gets reduced.
But where do they nail the money? In
Where
the
do they
bank or on the tree or in?
It comes to the
town's-
town and it goes in an interest-bearing account and it gets returned to say.
Okay, oh, doesn't say. Okay, since it's my turn again.
Sure, go ahead.
Down into the removal requirements, decommissioning, does this include pulling all of the, if we decommission the thing, you tear down all the posts, you tear down all the stuff, you take it away, we've got grass showing now. What about what's underground? Do we have to pull the lines that are underground? Do we have to pull out the entire underground system?
That's usually covered at the time. If this is something the board wanted to include, this is something that would be reviewed by legal. Basically, what you're doing is returning it to pre-solar install condition. So yes, in short, it would be everything.
Or is it customary to leave some things like the concrete in place, but just pull the lines?
That could be something to be worked out in a case by case. Probably is much different if you're looking at 2 or 3 installations as opposed to something like the board considered last week.
Okay. Then if we turn the page to the back, down to abandonment, how do you figure out if it's been abandoned? How do you figure out if this has been abandoned? Like what we were looking at last week, we've got a big field, it's out there. Is the town of Wolfeboro supposed to, every year, getting a report or something saying, well, we're up and running? How do we know if it's shut off? We're not gathering energy from there. How would we know if it's been abandoned for a year?
It's right up there with all enforcement. If it appears it's not being used, they haven't been showing up for site maintenance, they haven't been showing up for things like that, maybe it's obvious that wires aren't connected, it starts with a letter. It's come to our attention that the site
somebody
appears to
would
be
notice it.
abandoned, blah, 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 blah.
Well,
Just to drive by, somebody would notice?
No, I think that the people who were getting serviced with electricity would notice that they hadn't gotten it for a
Right.
time and say, what's going on in Wolfeboro? Just like if our cell phones stopped working, we would wonder what's happening with the tower and go check it out.
Right, but what I'm saying is that power wouldn't come to Wolfeboro. That power is going in the other direction. We'd never see it.
Yeah, but I would imagine that we'd hear that on WMUR. If, like, the town of Wakefield went dark because their solar wasn't working and it was up at Amanda's farm, we'd know about it.
It would be a courtesy to call around and say, hey, dudes, abandoned?
Keep in mind, what was in your packet is a draft that pulls all the
Yeah,
pieces
well, I'm
together from the model.
I'm just what-ifing, like,
So if the board is interested in having an abandonment clause that's similar to what's in the cell tower language right now, it can be there, it doesn't have to be there. The town might not be concerned about quote-unquote abandoned solar arrays.
I think the town should definitely be concerned with
Well, that's why I left it in there,
medium
but.
to
Yes.
large scale. Maybe not small scale, if on your roof, that's up to you. But if
yeah,
it's-
the next owner. But, anything big, it's like, I don't want to touch it. It's kind of like, leaving a public building full of asbestos. Nobody wants it.
Well, I think the abandonment section should be beefed up because you want to be careful that you don't have 20 acres of abandoned solar panels just lying out there in the ground for the next 100 years. So you have to beef up that somehow. Are you, is that
Yeah, my
all?
turn's over.
Okay, can I follow up on some of the ones you raised? In the E7, are we really going to require a performance bond from a solar farm owner or an irrevocable letter of credit in the same amount, which I presume ties up that man's funds for the rest of his life or the life of his ownership of the project? Is there do we require the same from a cell phone tower, for example?
You can. This is a list of you can put in order. It's up for the board to decide, is that appropriate?
I understand, Tavis. I'm not criticizing the language. All I'm suggesting is the board needs to think about that. Does the
Correct.
board
Typically,
want
Is that usual?
typically what I've seen done with both cell towers and solar arrays is that once the project is priced out, the same person puts together a price to remove it, and the town would secure those funds, not in an ongoing letter of credit, but it would be cash up front.
By the installer.
Correct.
and that means that cash up front is stuck away in some bank gathering interest to the account of the owner for as long as the solar farm is in operation. I would not want to go into that business.
I would not either.
Then I don't think that's if you want to encourage solar, don't do it,
Right.
obviously.
Remember, all of this is a function of when it's triggered. There's nothing to say that small, whatever small, medium, and large are defined as, the board gets to decide what is in the best interest of the town for, one, requiring site plan review. Currently, you have the ability to hold something similar for everything that goes to site plan review. It's typically done under the public utility portion of it, and once it's installed, it's done, because the town would take ownership. In this case, the town may never take ownership of it, as in the case of the last project you looked at. But there are some situations where this could be happening on private property for the ultimate benefit of the town, where it would protect the town to put such a clause in place.
I'm all for protecting the town, but if by protecting the town I drive away potential builders of solar systems, which would be beneficial to the town, it's cross purposes. So
Conceivably,
again, I would
yes.
suggest that when the board comes to look at this in detail, think carefully about whether you want to put up a performance bond or not requirement. In the removal requirements, one, abandonment and decommissioning, removal. Solar panels are not good for the environment once they're done. They're full of all kinds of toxic nasties. I would hate to think that a solar panel, say on the roof mount, would just get taken up to the dump or buried in the backyard. I think that in some way, the fact that the materials that are in solar panels are not the best things to have around should be specified in the removal requirements. In other words, treat them as if they were
Asbestos.
asbestos, something to that effect. Well, not asbestos, because that's got all kinds of nasties
Well,
involved.
but you need a permit to get rid of some of these
Some kind
things
of
like that.
hazardous material. There must be language out there that would cover that, but I don't think you want people dumping broken up, smashed solar panels up in one of the dumpsters at the dump.
Well, it
without
does say
telling
disposal
anybody.
of all solid and hazardous waste in accordance with local, state, and federal waste disposal regulations.
Fine.
And if you have them, then maybe we should
G1A2.
we should somehow draw people's attention to the fact that that this is not something just to get thrown into the garbage, that need to be taken care of more carefully, just to protect the town for the future.
I think that's in, decommissioning shall consist of, II, disposal of all solid and hazardous waste in accordance with. I'm also going to suggest that the person presenting the solar array that we approved was talking about a 30-year lifespan for those. And my thinking would be that 30 years from now, there is going to be demand for the material in those solar collectors, and so it is going to be beneficial for anybody to recycle them. But that's obviously 30 years out, but the technology and the way people recycle stuff probably will change in the next 30 years.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, well,
Let's just hope it happens.
but if we have to deal with hazardous waste, that's what they're
Well,
going to do.
if the board figures that 1A II is adequate, then I'm
Yeah,
fine with
it
that,
says
too.
their hazardous
Yeah.
waste have to be dealt with federal waste disposal regulations. That pretty much says it.
I have a question that's just dawned on me now. If Peter sells his house, and Peter sells his house, the next guy comes in, he wants to have his house inspected before he buys it. Okay, we have a house inspector, looks at the stuff, looks at the solar panels on the roof, says, oh, they're cool. And that happens once or twice. Who continues to inspect that solar array on your garage to make sure that it's up to standards? Once it's in place there, is it ever re-inspected?
Not by the town.
I would think it's the responsibility of the homeowner.
I would want to be sure.
Who would call the little guy over there that just slapped a magnetic sign on his truck and says, now I'm a home inspector?
Yes?
Said that off
Or a
microphone.
solar installer.
Or a solar installer, if
Yeah.
you called one of
Probably
those
not the
guys.
inspector, no.
'Cause they're not regulated in any way like that, are they?
They're regulated under the sense they have to be adequately connected to your electric service.
And that's it.
Well, that's really all that's happening. Sun magically,
Does its
electric
thing.
service. Yeah.
If I were an owner of a, say, a 3-unit or 4-unit condo, if such were allowed in the general residential district, and I wanted to supply solar to the units in my condo, and I couldn't put them on the roof, I had to have a ground mount, and it was going to be larger than 1,750 square feet, would I all of a sudden become a commercial operation? Would I be falling into your medium category with more requirements than if I were just?
Let's
homeowner
not confuse
putting it on the roof?
conditional use permit with, let's not confuse conditional use permit with commercial. But if
No,
you own a
I-
4-unit building, you're already commercial.
What I'm getting at, maybe I wasn't saying it right, what I'm getting at is this. We're allowing roof-mounted solar. That's, I guess, the understanding is an individual homeowner can put it up on his roof to get the benefit of having solar. But what about the guy who runs a condo or runs a 3 or 4 unit apartment building? And he wants to put solar in and he has to put a ground mount system in. It's not rooftop anymore. Does he fall under more restrictive requirements than otherwise if he would put it on his roof?
Depending on how it's defined, as shown here, yes, it would need a conditional use permit because it's on the ground.
Then I would suggest that much like we do with hotels, which have been screaming about being,
But hotels and 3 or 4-unit buildings are treated the same under building code.
well, in most of the hotels in this town, they're considered non-conforming uses
Unless they get a permit.
unless they get a permit. And that was one of the problems we heard in the hotel housing forum that we ran some years back. And that's a situation that has not been solved. The point being that if I want to get the benefit of solar into my small operation, and I'm not going to be pumping it into the system, and I'm only running it on a small size for 3 or 4 units, why do I have to go through the same kind of hoops that a commercial operation, which is running a 40,000 square foot operation, does?
We can draw the line wherever we would like.
I'm only throwing this out. This is the draft.
I would say if you're at
We're
3 or
talking
4
about-
units, you're already commercial, you're already not residential, you're commercial.
As a use, agreed, but we're talking about, I think it's a little different. We're talking about an application in that use which is beneficial to the town, beneficial to the country, beneficial to the planet, maybe, if you want to go that far, use of solar. Yet in order to get that benefit, we're treating that owner as if he were attempting to do a commercial use that required the same kind of scrutiny.
So you're suggesting perhaps on the bottom of page 2 that small-scale ground-mounted be a P in the commercial, as opposed to a C?
What I'm suggesting, no, I'm not suggesting anything specific, because I'm not going to be here long enough to want to have that kind of impact. What I'm suggesting is the board needs to look at that
Agreed.
and open these
Agreed.
categories up
Yes.
more than they are now.
I would suggest that the board learned, perhaps without realizing it, a good deal about solar at the last meeting. The small nuance of B soils becoming A soils and the relative, I'll say, transparency of the solar panel with regard to rainwater and other things that came out of that. Even though there were 23 acres, roughly 40% of which covered with panels, but it had zero impact on the underlying ground. Those are the types of things the board, and I can work to find training, readings, et cetera, on this. You know, if you're looking at existing apartment complexes or condo complexes, the only spot they can really plant something like this, if not on the roof, is going to be something the board already determined to be a landscape area or a parking separation or a screening element, et cetera. So we need to be looking at, to me, it's more where and how. I go back to Mike's original point. If you can put in a half a square foot of solar and generate 40 gigawatts, I don't care. I think what the board is really going to be faced with publicly is how much of this surface area are we permitting in what areas of town? You know, are we looking at allowing someone, if it's not an accessory structure, does it count towards lot coverage? If you have an acre in town, can you cover half of it with solar panels? You're basically having a net zero ground impact, but visually half your lot is now solar panel, which may or may not be deemed residential in character. So that's the type of thing I think the board is really looking at.
Yeah,
The abandonment, the decommission, all of that can be sorted out. That's the easy part. I think what the board needs to start thinking about collectively is how much of the town could be covered with solar panel. And I'm sure there are some in town that say every square inch possible is the best possible outcome. Others would rather not see it. And it's anywhere in that middle is what the board is going to be facing when and if this becomes an eventuality.
Yeah, the problem with these things is they're just so huge. I mean, they're big, and they're black, and they look kind of ugly, and they take up a lot of room. But of every solar ordinance I looked at in towns around the state, don't treat the solar panels as part of lot coverage.
Correct.
All right.
And that was I had to wrap my mind around that, because it seemed to me like it was definitely covering the lot, but it isn't actually covering the lot. Is the way they're structured, you have the ground is permeable and the rain is still getting
Yeah,
through.
it's kind of like an umbrella, just kind of,
It's like having a
But you
lot
still
of
gotta
bushes.
look at it.
Lot of bushes.
It's not covering the lot, but it's visually obliterating the lot.
Yeah,
right.
So how do you take a historic village like Wolfeboro and impart the,
yeah, and you know, when this comes to public hearing, a lot of the objection you're going to hear is going to be from people who are screaming about how ugly these things are and how much room they take up And how could you have that right next door to my little wonderful gazebo?
But yeah,
You're gonna
blocking the sun.
Well, you're going to need to be able to show them that you've done things like screening, stormwater management controls, preserve them.
One additional thing to consider is the changing form factor of solar panels. They're now offering roof mount solar that look like shingles, so it's not as cosmetically objectionable. And I can foresee in the future that they would offer, for example, you could get a carport to protect your car, and the top of it would be solar, but it would look like a carport, not like a solar panel. And
Yeah,
do we
did
wanna-
you see those ones over the parking garage in that one?
Yeah, yeah. So
They look
do
fine.
we want to consider that eventuality for our current regulations?
Yeah, I saw the reconstruction of a Roman villa in an Italian city. They had used those really cool Mediterranean-style tiles, half rounds. They were all solar panels. So it looked like an antique building, but
they all
every one
black?
of the tiles on the roof was a solar panel.
Solar
Were they
panel.
black?
Really cool. No, they were
They were
pottery
red?
colored. They were the red color.
The terracotta one?
Yeah, terracotta.
And it
that's it.
still picked up the
And
sun
they
just
still
fine?
work. Yep. Yep. So like Doug said,
Well,
technology is
They
changing.
still work, but they're not as effective. But when you take an entire roof versus just a black panel, it's just as effective.
The overall output's the same.
Correct.
Yeah.
One of the things that we also need to make sure, and I'm sure this would be obvious, but the input of these solar panels into the Wolfeboro electric grid, which is a reasonably small-scale grid and doesn't have some abilities to do things. And so therefore, we need to make sure that all our regulations are regulations which will go along with what Wolfeboro Electric deals with.
Yes,
and I believe-
I know that there's already a couple of residents that are suggesting that the current buyback is not sufficient.
Right.
So
and I
there's that
also-
balance that needs
And I
to-
also think that there have been a number, at least I've heard of one, whether it's true or not, I don't know, one which was going to be a larger project than Wolfeboro Electric thought they could handle.
Correct.
And, it turns out that solar electric is interesting, and apparently there's, I think it's one place where now there seems to be more nighttime electric use than daytime on many days. As in, if the solar panels are producing, then you don't need them, but you need them at night because they don't produce a whole lot at night, which is the reason they don't need lights on.
Right.
Well, we do need to pass this by Barry at the electric
Of course.
department. And so I don't know if we want to sit down and talk to him or let him take a look at it and provide us with comments.
My simple hope today was to have put something in front of the board so you could see what it would look like if the model morphed into a draft, get some feedback, whether it all be tonight or in coming days, where else does this need to go? Obviously, this is give or take 10 months away from going somewhere.
Right.
But the more we talk about it, the sooner the better.
Well,
Yeah.
ironically, tonight as I'm eating dinner, I'm going through Facebook on one of the Wolfeboro lines, and here's somebody talking about solar. Wanted to know how to install it. Who's got going on? Alan Fredrickson, is posting in because he's trying to do it too. And I'm like, well, this is kind of a cool night.
Yeah, in my tenure, I think there have probably been 15 or 20 solar installations in town and probably 5 or 6 geothermal installations in town. So people are watching the internet or watching the trends and trying things out. I don't know
Right.
how successful either or are, but it is coming.
Here's another odd question for Peter. Peter, what happens if you actually make more electricity than MED can take from you? Where does it go?
Well, that's essentially what they call net metering. Your electric meter runs backwards in essence.
Yes,
And
but-
you're selling the electric back to the utility.
But if they say, oh, too much, shut it off, where does it go?
No, it's not that they can't take it, it's that you don't get reimbursed for it. It all goes back in the line.
Okay, it's free, okay.
Okay, under the site plan E3 on safety, should we have more that the fire department should be looking at, or is that sufficient? I just remember during the last hearing for the solar array that there really was no way for the fire chief to get over there without using a four-wheeler. And, I mean, should we have him comment on the access and if it's sufficient or not? Because he did.
I think that's a good idea, and that should be part of the plan.
Yep.
And specifically with item 3 that you mentioned, Kathy, it says medium-scale ground mount. I assume it should also include large-scale.
Medium, large, yes. So, I mean, functionally, yes. Once you get into E, you're into a TRC meeting and the fire department is involved. 3 is medium and large, yes.
Could we just put in including access?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, the lighting, I mean, I assume that would be covered by our site plan regulations,
Where's lighting?
the lighting and glare.
I think the glare is coming from the
Yeah.
solar panels.
Right. And I'm not sure that's covered.
Lighting was mentioned in the last hearing that we had on solar, and so therefore we would expect that to be in the future.
So I think maybe E, site plan review design standards. In addition to those outlined in 173 blank, see the following. So it would include everything that's in traditional site plan, pay particular focus on these things.
Okay.
Which was the intent of E6. But E6 is focused on large scale. If we wanted to do medium and large scale, we could do that too.
Yeah, make 6 number 1 and make 6 number E1.
You
And
want-
throw in medium and large scale.
Or just say all.
Whatever the sizes are that you're going to be talking about.
Include
Yeah,
medium.
this original draft was based on medium being sort of a conditional use permit light, and then once you're at an acre plus, then it's full site plan, which is another avenue to go. The other option would be to make 6.1 include medium, and just everything follows through.
Well, medium can go up to 39,000 square feet. That's a pretty hefty size.
It is.
So maybe you ought to have medium
I
as
mean,
well as large.
some of these changes are going to be dependent on where the lines get drawn. I mean, maybe there's a small, medium, large, extra large. I don't know. A McDouble. I don't know what.
Charleston
where-
has something like that. Maybe the board might want to think about forming a subcommittee for this purpose and including Barry as a subcommittee member when needed and called upon, because you're going to need some kind of technical input that nobody here has currently, and only he does.
I don't know what Barry would be looking at.
Well, we've heard a whole bunch
I
of...
mean, it's fine. I just don't know what he would be looking at.
Well, he would...
It would give us some practical thoughts.
Practical thoughts on,
Right.
on tying a system into the town, so there was questions that we might have from the public at time of public hearing, we'd be prepared to answer.
Yep.
And in addition, if we're going to open up these 3 categories, a small, medium, and awfully big, into something else, then maybe Barry knows something about the something else that we don't, make the job a little easier or a little more technically. It never hurts to ask.
Sure.
Well, he wouldn't necessarily have to be a member of the committee, but he would be somebody who we would consult with.
However you want to work it out. Obviously, he's got a job and he's busy, but on the other hand, he's the repository of technical information,
Right.
that electrical stuff.
Yeah, I don't think we can go without having discussions with him.
No.
Yeah. Well, what about the noise? Would that be covered under the site plan regulations or not?
It would be covered under the noise regulations that you currently have. I don't know of any noise coming from a solar array.
I don't think they should make noise.
Oh, okay, I'm
A little
just
gentle
asking a
no,
question because it
no,
was brought up in the.
You
thing
have to
that
remember,
gave us.
this is DC power too, not AC power, so it's not going to have the hum.
Okay.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
Just ka-ching, 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 that's it. Ka-ching.
What about fencing around?
I would say that's covered under the screening and buffering of the site plan regs.
Okay.
Typically, there's not a lot of screening because once you get to the point where you've screened it, you've now buffered the effect of the solar.
Okay. Stormwater, it seems that we should mention it.
It, again, covered under all the base site plan regs, once you get to that size.
Okay, but they did have some exclusions for if they have to go to the state for an approval. And
In the last particular one, they needed to because of the acreage involved, yes. But if
Yeah.
you look at the basal area of impact alone, they don't qualify for either. When they told me that over the phone, I was quite honestly a bit flummoxed that AOT was triggered for putting some posts in the ground. But that's a call made at the state level.
Kind of a lot of posts, though.
It is, but it's well short of 3 acres of basal area of post.
Weren't they taking out a berm?
They're removing a berm.
Down the middle,
Yes.
yeah.
Which may have been the trigger.
That was the alteration of terrain problem.
yeah, right. Right.
Are there any particular impacts from solar installations in terms of stormwater runoff that the board is unaware of?
There was a question raised by one of the members of the Conservation Commission as an individual, not the commission, with some concern over focusing, if you will, the precipitate to a drip edge on the low side, and whether that would create a scenario that would affect runoff.
That's what I was wondering about, too.
Right.
That was generally dismissed in the last application because of the high permeability of the soil, but it might become a question depending on what the soils are. I don't know how you write a regulation on that.
Don't. What I would do is go out and look and see how everybody else has solved the problem, if it's even a problem to be solved,
Correct.
and steal their solution if it works for the town, or dismiss the problem because it's not.
Correct.
Okay, well, on this particular issue, they could ask for a waiver from the site plan, the stormwater.
They could ask for a waiver on anything in site plan, yes.
Okay. Let's see, accessory structure, do people think that we need this as an accessory structure, or how do you feel?
I think the board is going to be hesitant to make that call until you have more answers on stormwater impacts.
Okay, well, that was one thing you brought up, so I just wanted to get a...
Oh, I agree, but what I'm suggesting is that might not be something the board wants to decide tonight.
Okay, all right.
I honestly think a lot of this is going to boil down to how much coverage you allow, not as ground coverage, but what percent of a lot the board is going to allow by right and by conditional use permit. Thinking specifically in the village residential, probably, 30% in the village residential is going to look much different than 30% in the residential agriculture. So where do those lines get drawn? And perhaps those are the lines that help dictate where a conditional use permit is required.
Okay, and what about the zones that we talked about briefly? Tavis is suggesting pretty much all the residential zones.
Well, you've got to open those up, obviously.
What?
You have to open those up because they don't work. Who's going to put in a medium-scale, ground-mounted solar energy system, a conditional use permit in the shorefront residential?
Right, well,
Why are the large-scale not allowed in the rural residential and rural agriculture?
There are a lot of people that don't want to see the countryside overrun with solar panels.
Oh, completely understood, but where else are you going to find a 15, 20, 30-acre parcel where you can put yourself in a gigantic solar farm than in the RA and the RR?
There are plenty of shorefront parcels that would accommodate 20,000 square feet of solar panel. The table is all a function of where the definition is on size.
What I'm suggesting is let's be practical about how we split out our zones and think commonsensically, are we likely to see these sorts of things in these particular zones? And if we're not, then maybe we don't need to put them
Yes, this is a crude breakdown based on residential zones and commercial zones.
Right. Obviously, it's artificial and needs to be open.
So, Mike, are you suggesting we need more granularity?
Yeah,
Okay.
that I was trying to say.
Okay, well, what about the shorefront residential? You want to leave that for now?
If you want to sell this to the public, you would want to allow rooftop,
Yeah, right.
but
Absolutely.
nothing else. Put a big X on shorefront.
As big as those buildings are, yep, put it on the roof.
Yep. And make them all feel like they're not going to get surrounded by a solar farm one day.
They can get real pretty
So,
ones that they wouldn't even notice.
The practicality of this alleged ill granularity, if you will, is that this is allowing rooftop mounted systems townwide. This is contemplating that as a principal use in any residential zone, i.e. none of the residential zones should be used solely as a commercial array,
Correct, because that would be commercial
but a
use.
medium would be a conditional use permit. So this is looking at keeping the commercial uses in the commercial districts. I'm not sure there's an area in the commercial district that has a full acre to develop.
Yeah, right.
So, obviously you have to do some granularity here.
Correct. But the point is keep the commercial in the commercial zones and the residential in the residential zones. So the intent of this little exercise was to say, when is something irresidential, if you will? How much solar is not residential? So I simply gave a first cut at what is medium and large, so the board could think about, okay, how many panels is too much for a residential zone? Is it 1,800 square feet? Is it 20,000 square feet? And we can come up with all different ways to come up with this pictorially.
Now you're getting into the granularity part of it, aren't you?
Let's-
Obviously, this.
Yes, this was a thought-generating tool for the board to look at.
Doing exactly what it was supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that's going to have to go to the committee bit and, get the map out and just start going like
Yep.
this.
If you
know?
end up having a roof
And
that
if
is,
all of them did it, it would, oh dear. So maybe,
Yeah.
if you have a roof that's 1,000 square feet pointed to the south, probably that's the size of your collector. If you had 2,000 square feet headed south, that would be fine. So I think if it says that it's a rooftop, that sort of limits what it is. You don't need-
but if you
don't
only
need-
have 1,000 square feet of roof, but the solar guy convinces Peter, and Peter Goodwin himself, that he needs 3,000 square feet to be effective, is Peter allowed 2,000 on the ground and 1,000 on his roof?
But if it's all on the roof, if a rooftop is allowed in residential
Roof-
district,
roof
then
is
that's-
roof
that's
is roof,
fine.
correct.
So we don't have to worry about stating the maximum size.
No, there is no maximum size for rooftop.
I don't think there's an easy solution here. I think it's going to take work and a lot of parsing to come up with a regulation that's going to work for townwide.
Well, I mean, we're inventing something new. It's going to take, drawing with crayons and squinting and,
Yeah.
driving by someplace and go, what would that look like?
Look at the line.
Well, there's other ways to do it too. I mean, completely different. If you said rooftop, fine. Ground mount, fine, as long as it's serving the primary structure on the property. Maybe the board only wants to draw a line of a percentage, somewhere between 30 and 100%, is leaving the property, such as you looked at last time. That is solely generating power for over there. It's not, some was going to the house, some was going to the garage, some was going to the chicken coop, and a little extra was going back in the grid.
Then you're getting towards the purpose.
If your sole purpose for solar is generation, that's what's contemplated with the medium and the large.
Yeah, make it easy for the homeowner.
Correct,
Right.
Hold everybody else's feet to the fire.
correct. That's another way to draw where the P and the
Well,
C
that's
lie.
residential, commercial,
Yeah, that would make a lot
you
more
know,
sense.
Right.
buy it, sell it.
Brad, do you have any thoughts?
No, just really
I guess
absorbing a lot.
I have a problem with this idea that it's residential commercial, in that if my particular collector, for whatever reason, produces more electricity than we use in a given year, we're now selling electricity to the other people. So does that make me a commercial place even though I'm a resident?
No.
I wouldn't think so,
So-
Peter, because
so
your,
my-
your initial one was for yourself.
No,
You just
your
had- you've got
intent was to
extra
serve
zucchini.
yourself. The system has to reimburse you for something you're putting it out
Right,
to.
but does that put me as a commercial operator? So
No.
therefore I need, okay, so therefore that's not the issue.
I would not read it that way, no.
No.
But if you look at what you looked at 2 weeks ago, 23 acres that had
Oh, yes,
nothing to
completely.
do with the
That's not-
property it was on, that's the intent.
Okay.
And do we need to be concerned about conflating small, medium, large with commercial and residential?
No. I mean, the
The-
point was not to do that. yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think maybe we need to invent some new words while we're at it.
Okay, go ahead, Brad.
Third time?
I think one thing too to think about is usually when you have a house, something like that, of your residential usage, you pretty much know, can figure out the kilowatts you're going to need to operate that house. So if we came up with a formula for the size of the array that would go on that building, you know, to supply that amount of power with a certain, you know, percentage over whatever. But if they come in and, you know, do double or 3 times the amount, then maybe that's, you know, the number we need to take a look at to whether they're leaning more towards the commercial end and producing power, you know, more so than just, you know, using it for themselves. I think that's something, you know, I really agree. I think the committee is the way to go with this, to really hash out a lot of these details and bring back to the board here some recommendations and, you know, thoughts and stuff like that. I think these are all the kind of the details we've been talking about and get brought up at this committee level and be brought, you know, kind of ironed out, options put out, and then, you know, bring them back for more discussion.
Okay, all right, thank you.
It just occurs to me, like Brad said, no one's going to put a solar installation in his house without the intent of getting to net zero if he can, and if he's really lucky, selling some power back to the Wolfeboro Municipal Electric Department. So I think that kind of motivation should be encouraged by whatever ordinance that we come up with.
And interestingly, the MED policy, as I understand it, does not let you achieve net zero right now. I think they only do, what, 90%, something like that? I'm trying to remember what the current factor is, but
So in other words, I could not get $0 on my bill every month. I'd have to have 10% of my ordinary.
What ends up happening is that I have a solar collector, I deal with this. I have 2 meters. One measures how much energy I take from the power company, one measures how much I give to the power company. If I am giving more power than, if the power that I receive from them, I get, say, 14 cents a kilowatt hour. It turns out that because there is some need to, if I am grid tied, I am taking advantage of all the infrastructure, the wires and the maintenance. So therefore, if I produce kilowatts, I get about 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
Correct.
And so that is how it works. You know, one other thing I'm going to suggest is that we may want to be careful about how much, if we put limits on the size of a residential, because if I am a person who has 2 totally electric cars and I drive them 40 miles a day, I need to have something which is going to be able to charge those. So I think we really would need to be careful on limiting the number of kilowatts that my system is actually producing.
so,
And I haven't seen anything that limits the
Right.
capacity, only the area.
Right, but then again, you know, that's fine, but, you know, but it may be that someone wants to put in that regulation that says you can't have that amount, and it may be associated with how my production interacts with the Wolfeboro power system, which is a local and a small system, and therefore it may have its own individual problems because we do not have large manufacturing places using lots of electricity in a given time of day.
yeah, what's basically happening is I'm not aware of too many homes, if any. I can think of a business that has done this, but not homes that I can think of. Many do not invest in the battery system for their home. So they're using the grid as the battery, and that's
Mhm.
part of that difference between the 14 cents and the 10 cents.
But my point was simply this, that we should be encouraging individuals to use as much solar as they can, however we can, for their own personal purposes. And if that means running 3 or 4 Teslas as well as your house output or your usage of electricity, that's perfectly fine, because that's what we would want you to be doing. Take the pressure off of the grid and get some of that freebie sunshine. So whatever ordinance the board writes should be encouraging individual homeowner usage in whatever way is necessary.
Regardless of what it looks like?
I would suggest
I
we've
don't
had
have to worry about that at this stage.
I'd suggest that we've had a lot of conversation, and the next version of this will be something that we can discuss further.
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, it seems that everybody wants a committee, so,
I would think maybe somebody from MED, somebody from the Energy Commission, a couple of planning board members, and
conservation, and would it be okay if we got in touch with the Energy Committee?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, all right. Okay. Okay, so we have...
my thought is it might be a selected request, not a public
Yes.
outreach.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Smart
Right.
move.
Okay. Okay, well, as Tavis mentioned at the beginning of this was very good discussion. Thank you, folks. But we do have some time, so, you know, if we get a committee together, that sometimes takes a little longer. But we should be able to get it done this year, I think.
I would hope at this point.
Right?
I think it would only
Okay.
take a couple weeks for people to decide they wanted to and do
get
it.
it done this year. What was that?
It should only take a couple of weeks to contact everyone, and they can say yay or nay, and then make a
No, I
schedule.
understand about how to do it.
Yeah, but there's probably 60,000 flavors of this draft. At least,
That's right.
including Charleston, which is not, I mean, that went out to everybody, look at it, they are not horribly far apart.
They're all
Okay,
based on the same-
but everybody agrees this is a positive move.
Yes.
Yes.
Move. Yeah, okay, all right, good.
And the reason for coming, I mean, I spoke to Kathy about this. The reason for bringing this up right now, sort of out of the blue, it was on the work plan. You just sat through not having regulations. So my hope was, we just sat through one of these. What did we learn? What would we like to have? Is this getting there? Is it not getting there? I'm open for comments, fire away, and we'll get them all to the committee and go from there.
Okay, and it may not have been on our work plan, but it certainly is mentioned in the master plan.
Well, and it is being talked about online. I was a little surprised at how many comments there was in a 10-minute period as I was eating dinner. I was like, oh, this is timely. So people are asking the questions.
Okay,
And to follow that up, I do not believe there is a need for a geothermal ordinance. That is a self-contained thing. You know,
We have rocks.
it happens, it's a building code function more than anything else. I don't really think the planning board needs to get into that unless people are getting
Unless a problem occurs.
really creative, yeah.
Geothermal is just a heating system, and we aren't going to regulate heating systems.
Right. Well, this is just a power system, but here we go. Just like small wind. The parallel between this and small wind is very easy to draw. There's not much of a correlation between solar, small wind, and geothermal. This is not even visible.
Unless you happen to be in Iceland.
Remember how long it
Peter went there. I mean, we can,
Remember how long it took us to get the small wind turbine ordinance organized? That was a long process.
yes,
And we
right.
needed to call in some outside assistance as well, and just lucky that it turned out that there's really no place in Wolfeboro where you can put one of these things where it would work commercially.
Okay, well, Tavis, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, lot merger. Gave us some information on,
I mentioned it on the agenda. I put a handout in front of everybody. This is a lot merger that the board looked at several years ago, but never actually acted on. So I'm just bringing it back to the board. No concerns as far as the regulations are concerned. Both parcels are town-owned property. This is the Pop Whalen and its neighbor. And I would recommend that the board accept and take action to approve this, unless there are questions.
Okay, anybody have any issues with this?
Nope.
Okay. And somebody wants to make a motion to approve this merger application?
So moved.
Okay, and I'll second it. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Does that mean aye or aye opposed?
I was late. Aye.
Okay.
Went too quick.
Like, let's discuss that one. All right.
Might get this. Okey-doke. Non-conforming structure regulations. We talked about this briefly.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go into it in too much more detail right now. There are a number of instances where non-conforming structure or expansion or enlargement are discussed in the ordinance. Some are under non-conforming structures, some are in the Wetland Conservation Overlay District, and they are not consistent. I had mentioned to Kathy a couple of weeks ago that in going back into the mid-90s, I can find a version of what is currently written in the ordinance, but it's written much differently than what's currently in the ordinance. This is also being brought up because one of the petition warrant articles that didn't actually make it through the process, I went over them briefly at the last meeting, was touching on this very same thing. The substance of the petition was to look at foundation wall versus eave line. Some of them, you know, again, there have been numerous attorneys on the applicant side of things saying, am I allowed to 25% based on the existing home? Am I allowed 25% based on the existing portion that's in nonconformity right now? Do I need a special exception for any expansion? Do I only need a special exception if it's over 25%? And the ordinance doesn't appear to be worded entirely consistently all the way through. So at an upcoming work session, I'm going to come back and see where the board lands. I would suggest you look at that, and I can send you a link if you want in the meantime. Remember, you're not beholden to what's currently written, but the intent, and I can go through some real-world applications of each instance that have come up, and it's very hard to tell. Speaking with Kathy, the last time the board looked at this, the intent was to make it clearer,
Right.
but sometimes when you make it clearer, you show all the boxes but the three you forgot about.
Yeah,
So which box is that supposed to be in? So I think in that particular case, it became more convoluted than it needed to be.
right.
So that's an upcoming
Maybe you should say
discussion.
something to the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah, right. What I was going to suggest is if you could sit down and talk to Jason, the code officer, and see, because he must be stumbling over it, and come back with some suggestions, and then everybody needs to take a look at this and figure out if you can read it and understand it. That would be very helpful.
Yes.
And if we could talk about that, I'm not sure about the next meeting, but the meeting after the first
April
one.
work session, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that would be...
Conceive, I mean, yes, I will say the one thing that stands out the most, in the Wetland Conservation Overlay District, it says you can replace it in kind, but you have to meet the three-dimensional envelope of the original structure, which is inconsistent with so many other sections of the ordinance. Yes,
Yes,
three-dimensional
yeah,
envelope.
that's what it says.
I've run it
Well,
by,
that was a committee thing.
I've run it by probably 3 members of Concom, and they each have said, what difference does it make if it gets taller? A second-story roof doesn't have greater impact on the ground than a one-story roof.
Doesn't it get more rain?
It gets rain sooner, but the same amount makes it to the ground, just slightly later.
Sooner.
But if you, but, Arguably, at 9.8 meters per second squared, it would, but isn't it actually slowing its original acceleration when it hits the roof and then restarting, so it might actually
No,
be
I think by
slower?
the time it hits the roof, it has reached terminal velocity, so it wouldn't.
That's
Yeah.
my point.
Yeah.
So it starts over. So
Right.
it'll hit the ground, and you'd see the point. There are some things that just don't make
Yeah, okay,
sense.
so we need to look at that overlay district plus the non-conforming.
Yes.
Yes, so
Yes,
be
my-
sure and take a look at that.
My goal is going to be this is very similar to the multifamily discussion where there's a little bit here, 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 and here. And the whole point is to bring it out and say, this is what you do.
Yeah, right, because after we talked, I thought, so I went back and looked at that. Everything quickly came back to me.
Yeah.
And I think Conservation Commission was represented on that committee.
And I'll try and be as politically correct as I can. There are a number of architects currently working under the existing definitions that are coming up with some, I'll say, creative design solutions to this, but their creativity is atypical for the neighborhood, so I don't know if it's really something that should be endorsed, all for want of need of a variance, if you will. But that is what that section is going to be.
Okay. All right, next item is the short-term rental. I'm sort of wondering how people feel about what we should do. I don't know about anybody else, but I hear an awful lot about this. And as a matter of fact, I talked to a woman today that is not able to stay in where she's staying because the person wants to go to the short-term rental. And she said, well, it's money. And I said, well, yes, right, but anyway, so.
Isn't there something on the things we're going to vote on associated with
Yes,
short-term rental?
yes, there is that.
So I would suggest that we should delay any discussion really until
Okay.
after we know how that comes out.
Okay,
Because if it comes out the way we thought it should come out, then we can maybe think about other things to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't come out the way we wanted it to, then we have to go back to Plan B or C or D or whatever. So I would say defer it until after the vote.
okay,
To that end, I do, with our somewhat maximized public audience that may not be here but listening, the warrant article does nothing to those that have been doing short-term rental. That is a call I have received probably 30 times today.
Correct.
About what happens. My parents did it, I did it, I am doing it. We have been doing it, any version of that. The warrant article does not touch that. There have been 10 to 15 phone calls in the last 2 weeks about if I buy it, can I? And I have to have the discussion of this is what the rules currently are, this is what's currently on the ballot, and this is how that would play out. I've tried to remind people that the planning board or the short-term rental committee could not define a clear line of what was quote-unquote wrong with short-term rentals, but that the general consensus seemed to be that it needed a term. So I originally, prior to Peter's comments, was going to talk about what the next steps would be. But I will reserve that until a later meeting unless the board wants
Yeah.
me to.
Let me just make
yeah, okay.
just make a point in using Peter's analogy. There is currently no Plan B. There is Plan A,
Correct.
warrant, and if Plan A doesn't work, there is no Plan B. And I would
Correct.
much prefer the board have at least thought about maybe what a Plan B might want to look like if Plan B doesn't work before getting presented with the fact that, well, you don't have Plan A anymore, so what are you going to do now?
But-
I would advise the board to check with the state and observe what's going on in the State House. Bills are continually being presented by members of the House regarding short-term rentals, and they're going either as far as they can or they're getting tabled. That's probably where you're going to get the most effective legislation on short-term rentals over and above what even if our Plan A does succeed. So it'll at least be thinking about one, having a Plan B, and two, what the state's up to, so that you're not surprised?
I do think that we need to ultimately look at what is required of a person or group who is doing the short-term rentals, as into whether their septic system is appropriate for the number of people, whether parking is available and such and things like that. But that's something that the grandfathered people in should be dealing with already. But that is something ultimately which is important for the well-being of our water source. And so I think that we ultimately are going to need to deal with the people who are, already doing it.
Just for planning board edification, I'm receiving an interesting number of calls wondering if the short-term definition only applies to the ADU warrant article, and I'm having to separate those out, pointing out that ADU says that neither the ADU nor the home shall be used as a short-term rental, or, and then it has the definition of a short-term rental. And they said, well, if you're looking at a definition, why are you also putting in the definition? I said, because the term might fail. And the planning board wanted to emphasize that if we're going to create a housing opportunity, it was for a housing opportunity, not for an additional short-term rental opportunity. So.
Okay, very good. Accessory structures, the habitable discussion.
So this is.
Have that now, or do you want to?
This is a discussion that's been kicked down the road for a while.
Yes.
I know, I'm confident that I understand why the board originally put in the half bath on the ground floor. I understand all of the passion, conviction, and everything that Kathy and the board and zoning board and everything behind it. One of the questions that came to me recently is if someone has an existing accessory structure, and should the warrant article pass, that's a caveat, request an accessory dwelling unit on the second floor of such an existing accessory structure, is that not in fact a violation? So I would, again, all I'm going to say tonight, because we can go round and round on frankly what I think people intend and people think it says as opposed to what it says, but a bathroom is not considered habitable space in the building code. And if someone is actually looking at, it seems one of the giant concerns about bathrooms and accessory buildings was the quote-unquote illegal conversion. There's a means to rectify the said conversion right now beyond entire removal, which would be a conditional use permit for an accessory dwelling if the article passes. Even without the article passing, I don't know what we're furthering for public life, safety, welfare by preventing a bathroom on the second floor of an accessory building. I know what the fear is that drove it, and I know that people that break the law, but right now we're also inhibiting those that want to follow the law. So that's where that.
Okay, well, as far as the proposed ADU, I mean, that calls it a dwelling, and so.
An accessory dwelling, yes.
Yeah, right, and so.
But it's functionally an accessory structure with the full bathroom on the second floor.
Well, an accessory dwelling is what I'm focusing on.
Right.
So.
What I'm suggesting is that
I don't
the
think
half
that
bath is superfluous to what building code would otherwise allow. To that end, the building inspector already has a no habitable space created with this permit, no living space created with this permit, and that's something that's getting stamped across everything. So
And that happens even if there is a bath.
Correct.
Yes.
So there are instances where people are coming in to finish their existing basement, and they'll say family room and bath. No bedrooms approved, no living space approved, things of that nature. That can be done very easily in a barn. We're seeing more and more people trying to work from home and have more space in their barns, or say, what can I use in my barns? Or, what can I use my barn for? It was originally a farmhouse. I don't need a hay mow. I don't need this. I don't need this. I'd like to do X, Y, and Z upstairs, and boy, wouldn't it be great to have a bathroom. Sorry, you can have a half bath on the ground floor. Doesn't happen a lot.
But it's perhaps now an unneeded restriction.
Yes, I don't think the board had a full understanding of what building code allowed the town to do prior to putting that in the regulations. Another way around this would be to add things to the accepted list from accessory structures. Right now, we accept a pool, but not a pool house. I don't know if the board or the town is necessarily opposed to having a pool house with a pool, where the pool house had a bathroom. Typically, and I'll be blunt, the people that are asking for bathrooms, other than what's currently allowed by the ordinance, are not those that are going to slipping in apartments. It's a much different income level than that.
So the risk is low.
The risk is low. Well, the risk is low for allowing a bathroom that becomes an illegal apartment, if you will.
Yeah.
A fear 20 years ago, but the economics and the demographics of the town have changed and moved beyond that now.
So that's all I have on that.
Okay. Anybody else have anything? All right, on to the minutes, February 14th.
Page 2, down near the bottom, P. Goodwin acknowledged benefit of improving the septic, but felt.
Yep.
Phil, huh?
I fell, but I felt.
Okay, I'll go on page 3. Add a paragraph after the one that says K. Barnard stated the driveway. Add the paragraph to read as follows. Von Dugan noted no buildable space at Area 4. Is that what explained why Mike Hodder all of a sudden changed his opinion?
Von Dugan noted no buildable space, Area 4. Okay.
Right. And then on page, where are we now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Page 5, top of the page, M. Hodder, this goes on, delete from stated through however. I recognize that we didn't have jurisdiction because it wasn't a multi-jurisdictional application, but I did say that wondered whether we shouldn't send out a notice through municipal congeniality.
You said that. Mm-hmm. You said that.
Yes, and that's why if you take out what I suggested you take out, it will reflect exactly what it was I said.
So you want Mike Hodder,
I want the words from the word stated
Yep.
through the word however removed.
Mike Hodder wondered if
Thank you.
a notice.
okay, but you said all of that.
No, actually, you raised the issue
I
of whether there
keyed
was
it with jurisdictional, you
multi-jurisdictional,
said-
and I said, no, there isn't. And my conclusion was, I did not say there was multi-jurisdictional in this case, because I recognize there wasn't.
I was actually trying to give the board credit for accepting jurisdiction because one of the board's failings rather often is to not accept jurisdiction of permits from the get-go, but we can remove it.
If you'd like to include Tavis Town Planner stated that clearly the board had jurisdiction.
No, because the board has to make that jurisdiction. It's removed.
Tavis observed that the board might, should it wish to adopt.
Okay, anything else? Somebody want to make a motion?
I move that there is amended, minutes are approved as amended.
Second, Peter.
Okay, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Going to abstain.
And
I wasn't
Brad
here.
abstains. Okay.
Move to adjourn.
Second?
Unless there's anything further to do.
All in favor?
Aye.
Who
Okay.
that was?
I move.